Trump says, I'm not a dictator, I just know how to stop crime. And I take him at his word, because when has he ever told a lie? But I will say this, page 1 of the Dictator Handbook is pretexts. You find a pretext to do what you want to do anyway. Say you want to invade another country. Well, you say that some people of your ethnicity living in that country are being persecuted. Voila, reason to invade. But as pretexts go, big balls getting mugged, that takes some big balls.
During the most recent episode of Real Time with Bill Maher, Maher sounded the alarm and a pretty chilling warning about Donald Trump's authoritarian deployment of the National Guard and the military in the streets of America, even as Democratic governors like Gavin Newsom and J.B. Pritzker are also sounding the alarm that Trump intends to do that to disrupt future elections. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, so listen, again, one of the things that I appreciate about Bill Maher, even though I disagree with him on his culture war takes and his tendency to both sides those issues, is the fact that even after having dinner with Donald Trump, which I would not have gone to, but he went and he said he criticized Trump to his face, told Trump that he's scaring people and he's acting like an authoritarian. One thing I appreciate about Maher is after having done that, many people expected that he would just start kissing Trump's ass, because that's typically what we see from commentators and even politicians, that they somehow fall under Trump's spell. And again, whether you like Maher or not, whether you agree with his politics or not, or his policy, and I understand he's too centrist for a lot of people, myself included, when it comes to being relentlessly anti-Trump, he still hasn't deviated. Even after that dinner, he has continued in pretty much every damn episode of Real Time with Bill Maher to call out the excesses and abuses of Donald Trump and the Trump administration. And once again, he dedicated a monologue to doing just that, talking about Trump using an authoritarian pretext to deploy the National Guard and the military to basically make them his own personal police unit. And again, we're only 7 months in. So let's play this other clip, and then we'll get into some reporting on warnings from Democratic governors like J.B. Pritzker and Gavin Newsom, which echo what Bill Maher is saying here.
And yes, military states can reduce crime. Point conceded. Will militarizing our cities make them safer? Yes, but not safer for democracy. Once it's normal to have an army loyal to you already in the streets, game over. That is how all future political disputes will be decided. Folks, it's not worth the trade-off. Everything in life is a trade-off. You want to reduce traffic fatalities to 0? Stop using cars. You want to eliminate drug overdoses? Make the penalty for possession death, like they do in Saudi Arabia. But we're not the cut off his hands people. Qatar is a lovely place to get a free plane. I wouldn't want to live there.
So again, I appreciate the fact that he's calling out even Trump's corruption there. With all the stuff going on with Donald Trump and the second Trump administration, it tends to get lost that Trump corruptly accepted a $400 million luxury jet from Qatar, right? That is an element of Trump's corruption that we simply can't ignore. But the corruption aside, let's think about the authoritarianism here. One of the things that we keep hearing is, well, crime has fallen in Washington, D.C. And according to even D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, who's no fan of Trump's, that seems to be true. And it's not exactly surprising when you have armed National Guard troops snaking their way through the streets of Washington, D.C., when you have the military in force or quasi-military unit like the National Guard, right, in the streets. Yeah, that may deter crime. But is that something to celebrate? I mean, Nayib Bukele, who is the president of El Salvador, big fan of Trump's. Trump's a big fan of his. He was recently, of course, in the Oval Office. That was when Gilmar Brego Garcia, was unlawfully, illegally, basically human trafficked out of this country and sent to CCOT in El Salvador. And then Bukele showed up to the White House. He's a MAGA-like troll, right? He's a lot younger than Trump, but he has many of the similar characteristics. He's really, really popular in El Salvador because crime has fallen precipitously on his watch, but it's because he's an authoritarian, because he has accrued a lot of executive power. He is ruthless in exercising that power. He's a right-wing authoritarian who has cracked down on civil liberties and human rights in El Salvador, and he is brutal. Trade-off is crime's lower. So according to a lot of the polls, he's pretty popular in El Salvador. And he actually, of course, as many, populist right-wing authoritarians are, he has just modified his constitution in El Salvador such that he's entitled to subsequent terms, right? So again, this is what Maher is saying. Like, okay, nobody's saying that in theory you couldn't radically reduce crime by deploying the military into the streets, but that's not a good thing, right? There are higher principles. We don't want to become a military dictatorship. We don't want that. We don't want to become El Salvador. At least we shouldn't. That's what he's getting at. And that's why, there have been lines about, how people are willing to trade liberty for some short-term security. Now, obviously, again, there's a balancing act, right? We don't have unlimited liberty, nor should we. We can't have a functioning society that way. The government has to infringe on some activity and some rights so as to have order, peace, and security. That's the tension that all governments have, right? That's why here in America, you've never been able to just be able to do whatever the hell you want whenever you want, nor should you be. It's the balancing act. But Trump is excessively authoritarian in instinct. And as he says, we've just never seen throughout history this idea of where the military would be deployed, basically for domestic law enforcement purposes, which, by the way, defies not only the spirit of the Constitution, but the word of federal law, the Posse Comitatus Act, which prevents the military from being used for domestic law enforcement purposes. Trump wants to violate all of that. Do we really think that even if we granted the premise, it's just temporary to crack down on crime, that there wouldn't be civil liberties and human rights abuses? That the military is not trained for domestic law enforcement purposes. That's why you have a civilian domestic police force and you have an offensive military unit. I mean, there's very little by way in terms of like the Venn diagram between the military and police in this country, very little. Now, there have been efforts to militarize the police even further. That's also dangerous. But it's a totally different mindset, a totally different mission statement. The military is generally not good at civilian domestic law enforcement purposes. Even now with the National Guard, they're supposed to not lead investigations. They're not supposed to, make arrests, right? They're basically supposed to be there to back up law enforcement purposes. But if you actually started to give them carte blanche to do those things, and Trump not only deployed the National Guard in Los Angeles, he actually sent active duty Marines to Los Angeles, which is an even greater escalation. All sorts of problems can ensue, even if we grant the premise that generally we might see a reduction in crime. And then there's the matter that Bill Maher is hinting at, which is it's likely to remain permanent that way if it becomes the norm. When has it ever become the norm and then it recedes? When has there ever been a military dictatorship just to suppress crime and then the military dictator's like, okay, I'm done. Military withdraw. We're going to have actual democratic elections. I'm not running. I'm out of this. When do we see shit like that? Nowhere. So with that in mind, let's also get to this recent article in the Rolling Stone magazine by Tim Dickinson, which goes into some of the warnings of J.B. Pritzker and Gavin Newsom. Blue state governors warn Trump may use military to disrupt elections. Pritzker and Newsom believe Trump's National Guard deployments are a threat to fair elections. Blue state governors are sounding the alarm that an increasingly authoritarian Donald Trump has designed to disrupt, upcoming elections with military assets. J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, is exhorting Americans to treat Trump's stated goals for deploying the National Guard to blue cities like Los Angeles, D.C., and Chicago with deep skepticism. Quote, he has other aims other than fighting crime, Pritzker's told Face the Nation of Trump's threatened troop deployment to his state. Quote, he'd like to stop elections in 2026, or frankly, take control of those elections, Pritzker asserted. The governor added that by pre-positioning troops, Trump could attempt to impose his will on locally administered elections. Quote, he'll just claim that there's some kind of problem with an election, and he's got troops on the ground that can take control. Invoking the collapse of democracy of Germany in the 1930s, Pritzker warned that Trump has learned from, quote, authoritarian regimes across history, and that one of the primary ways authoritarians have consolidated power is to provoke, quote, mayhem that requires military interdiction. The governor continued, quote, Donald Trump is just following that playbook. Pritzker is not alone in issuing stark warnings about the danger Trump's domestic military deployments could pose to free and fair elections in this country. California Governor Gavin Newsom also gave voice to the same concern during a conference call late last month organized by the Democratic National Committee. Newsom said the National Guard troops, Marines, and other federal agents Trump has deployed to Los Angeles could be used to stoke fear at the ballot box as soon as this November. Trump recently extended the deployment of National Guard troops to California for another 90 days. Quote, we still have federalized National Guard, interestingly assigned through Election Day, Newsom said. Quote, is that coincidental? Through Election Day? Quote, that's a preview for the National Guard of things to come, Newsom insisted. Quote, don't think for a second now that ICE and Border Patrol won't be showing up at voting booth or polling places this November. The governor added, quote, we can talk about authoritarianism, and I know it turns some people off, but at least we can submit that this is encroaching authoritarianism. Concerns about Trump using federal power to interfere in American elections, which are administered by state and local authorities, is not abstract. Just as he's ramped up National Guard deployments on two coasts, Trump has gone on a public offensive against mail-in voting, a move he said was inspired by a chat with Russian strongman Vladimir Putin. Vote by mail is secure and popular as a method of casting ballots, relied on by absentee voters across the country. Universal vote by mail is practiced in red and blue states across the West. There is no evidence that mailed ballots create opportunities for fraud. But Trump is already using his presidential powers to punish states that rely on them. He justified his decision this week to relocate Space Force headquarters to Alabama because its current location, Colorado, quote, went to all mail-in voting, Trump said, alleging that the state therefore has, quote, automatically crooked elections. It's not difficult to connect the dots of how these paired developments endanger democracy. Ending remote voting and then using military assets and federal law enforcement assets to intimidate voters at physical polling stations and could suppress turnout in large cities where opposition to MAGA policies is strongest. To be plain, any election interference by Trump would not be legal. Quote, there is no law that allows the president to deploy the armed forces in any context to prevent a free and fair election or to overturn results of an election, said Lisa Goyton, a senior director of the Pro-Democracy Brennan Center, on a recent call with reporters. Indeed, she added, quote, there are laws that specifically prohibit the armed forces from being involved in interference with an election. Quote, that would be a coup, essentially led by the president against our democracy, she said. In his second term, Trump has not paid much heed to what's legal. In fact, a district court judge ruled this week that Trump's National Guard deployment in California violates a bedrock law, called posse comitatus, because Trump is effectively transforming these troops into, quote, a national police force with the president as its chief. The administration immediately appealed the ruling, which has stayed. The 47th president is playing with fire rhetorically, toying with the authoritarian labels that his Democratic critics are appending to him. Quote, they say, he's a dictator, Trump mocked in a recent Oval Office appearance, before adding with menace, quote, a lot of people are saying, maybe we like a dictator. Trump then said he rejected the label, asserting he's just, quote, a man with common sense who knows, quote, how to stop crime. A veteran of Trump's 2020 attempt to subvert an American election, he is already laying out ideas about how Trump could assert emergency control over future federal contests. Cleta Mitchell is, quote, an election integrity lawyer and right-wing activist who infamously joined Trump on the 2021 phone call in which he pressed Georgia state officials to, quote, find enough votes to overturn Joe Biden's election in that state. As flagged by Democracy Docket, Mitchell recently appeared on a podcast where she highlighted the president's ability to intervene in voting by citing a, quote, threat to the national sovereignty of the United States. Mitchell argued such a threat would be easy to, quote, establish because of how, quote, porous state-run elections are. Quote, I think maybe the president is thinking that he will exercise some emergency powers to protect federal elections going forward, Mitchell said. Trump's counterweights in the states are calling on Americans to wake up. Quote, nothing about this is normal, Newsom said. Quote, we're not going to act as if anything is normal any longer. This exact note was echoed by Pritzker in a news conference this week, warning against the deployment of federal forces to a state. Quote, to everyone listening, but most especially the press, I refuse to pretend any of this is normal. Pritzker denounced the, quote, abject cruelty that we're seeing play out with the execution of Trump and Stephen Miller's policies, whether that's brutally rounding up law-abiding immigrants or responding to sandwich-throwing civilians by deploying armed military forces in the streets of the Capitol. The Illinois governor closed with a chilling warning that the past may be prologue. Quote, any rational person who has spent even the most minimal amounts of time studying human history has asked themselves one important question. Once the administration gets the citizens of this nation comfortable with the current atrocities committed under the color of law, what comes next? Yeah, pretty chilling stuff. Great article. And this, again, ties in with what Bill Maher is warning about. And we do need to wake up, folks. I'm sorry. Liberals, progressives, leftists, people who are in the pro-democratic umbrella, neocons, never-Trumpers, people who don't want authoritarianism, you do need to take this seriously. And this idea that, again, we don't have to worry about it. Trump has been defeated before he lost the 2020 election. You know, Democrats won in sweeping terms the 2018 midterms when Trump was in power. You know, we're probably going to win these. We don't have to worry about it. Trump has already attempted in the past to stay in power unlawfully before the January 6th insurrection, the fake elector scheme, and he's much more bold now, and there are fewer voices of dissent and checks against him in his own party now than there have ever been. Why the fuck should any of us assume he won't try to do it now? There's no good reason to assume that he won't try to do it again. And given that he's more powerful, more unhinged, and less checked than before, that's something all of us should take seriously, period. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.